It was a crime that beggared belief in its brutality, senselessness, and callousness. 3 innocent children mercilessly murdered by their babysitter, David McGreevy, on Friday the 13th, and then left impaled on garden railings. The passage of more than 4 decades can't begin to lessen the horror of the actions of Friday the 13th killer, David McGreevy. But just who was this killer? Who did he murder? What drove him to act so wickedly? And how could it be possible for the man known as the Monster of Worcester to one day be back on our streets a free man? It was 1972, and Cleve Ralph and his wife Elsie had a new boarder at their small home in Worcester. David McGreevy had been an old-school friend of Cleve's, and he joined the Ralphs and their 2 children, Paul, who was 3, and 20-month-old Dawn, in the city's Gillum Street. Elsie was also pregnant at the time, and when she gave birth to Samantha in September of 1972, there were 6 people in the small 2-bedroom house. But what had led David to here? David's childhood had been spent making the frequent moves common to families of military personnel. His father, Thomas, was an Army sergeant, and when David left school, he followed his dad into the forces, joining the Royal Navy, which was his dream job. Disappointment and shame followed, however, when he was court-martialed and ultimately dismissed from the Navy. An incident involving getting drunk and an act of arson had been the beginning of the end of his naval career. Indeed, troubles with drink would be a consistent feature for McGreevy. As well as his childhood dream ending, David also had a short-lived and intense relationship that ended in him being dumped by his fiancée on New Year's Eve in 1971. A disgruntled David was then kicked out of his parents' home when they'd had enough of his lazing around feeling sorry for himself. And so it was that he came to live with the Ralphs and their children. David was said to be good with the children, and he would sometimes help out by babysitting while Cleve worked as a lorry driver and Elsie did shifts at a pub. And on Friday the 13th, in April of 1973, Elsie had been working at the pub, and Cleve, as he often did, went to have a last pint before closing time and to pick his wife up after her shift. When Cleve had left home, his children were asleep. Looking after them was David McGreevy. Earlier that evening, David had been to the pub. He'd had between 5 and 7 pints and played cards and darts with a friend, with whom he'd had a small altercation after David put out a cigarette in his pal's drink. Cleve had picked up David from the pub and brought him home to look after the kids while he went to collect Elsie. When Cleve and Elsie returned home, they would have been shocked to find their house surrounded by police, who would not let them enter their home, and instead took them to the police station. Once there, the couple were told the unthinkable news, that their 3 children were all dead, murdered. That night, in the hour between 10:15 p.m. and 11:15 p.m., McGreevy, drunk, presumably in a bad mood, lost his temper while looking after the little Ralph children. It's believed he became infuriated with baby Samantha's crying for her bottle. But rather than tending to her needs as any caring babysitter would have, he instead snuffed out her life and those of her older siblings. First, 9-month-old Samantha died from a fractured skull. Dawn, just 2 years old, had her throat slit, and 4-year-old Paul was strangled to death. Shockingly, McGreevy's violence towards the poor innocent children did not end with their deaths. He retrieved a pickaxe from the basement of the house and proceeded to mutilate their bodies with it. He then impaled the 3 bodies on the wrought iron fence of a neighbor, almost as if he were displaying his hellish handwork. With that, David McGreevy left the scene of his wicked crimes. In the early hours of that morning, McGreevy was arrested as he walked the streets. Having initially denied his crimes, he later admitted, "It was me, but it wasn't me." He then went on to explain, "I put my hand over Samantha's mouth, and it went from there. It's all in the house. On Paul, I used a wire. I was going to bury him, but I couldn't. I went outside and I put them on the fence. All I could hear is kids, kids, kids." Because McGreevy pleaded guilty after a court hearing lasting just 8 minutes, he was sentenced to life in prison to serve a minimum of 20 years. Despite the horror of his crimes, McGreevy remained relatively unknown to the public until it was revealed in 2016 that he could soon be released. Pictures showed him on the street while on day release in 2006, and it was confirmed that a panel of the parole board was considering McGreevy's parole review. For many, the thought of David McGreevy walking out of prison a free man is too much to bear, given the nature of his crimes.